The birth of a legend. The northern wind blew fiercely that night, as if the gods themselves wished to announce something. High above the palace of Pella, in the heart of the kingdom of Macedonia, the sky opened in flames while lightning cut through the darkness like spears fallen from Olympus. Some spoke of an omen, others of a simple storm, but the truth is that on that night, while the world slept unaware of what was to come, a child named Alexander was born. It was the 6th of July in the year 356 before Christ, and nothing about his arrival was ordinary. Ancient chroniclers tell that at the very moment of his birth, the temple of Artemis in Ephesus burned to its foundations. A coincidence, some might say. But for the Greeks of that time, this was an unmistakable sign. A divinity had abandoned its dwelling to attend the birth of someone destined to change the course of history. These stories, woven between myth and reality, were not simple anecdotes, but rather the first sign of how the tale of Alexander began to be dyed with wonders long before he could even speak. His life would never be told as that of an ordinary man, because it never was. His father was Philip II, king of Macedonia, a man who with intelligence, strength, and brutality had turned a land of scattered tribes into a military power feared throughout the Greek world. His mother, Olympias of Epirus, was a woman as fascinating as she was fearsome, initiated into Orphic cults and known to sleep with snakes in her bed. Since childhood, Olympias had been educated in the old Thracian religions, in the Dionysian mysteries, in the idea that blood could burn with the fire of the gods. She did not see herself as a mere royal wife. She was convinced that divinity ran through her veins, and that her son, born of prophetic dreams and signs in the sky, was destined for something greater than any other man born until then. Legend has it that shortly before conceiving Alexander, Olympias dreamed that a lightning bolt pierced her womb as she slept. Philip, for his part, dreamed that he sealed his wife's womb with the emblem of a lion. Those dreams were interpreted as celestial messages. And in an age when dreams were seen as forms of contact with the beyond, it was not strange that people began to speak of that child as if he were a hero touched by the gods before even opening his eyes to the world. Alexander grew up in the palace of Pella, surrounded by symbols, omens, and an invisible tension that pushed him forward. From a very young age, he learned to walk among power, pride, violence, and glory. He did not live an innocent childhood. Games were training, words were politics, and every glance from his mother carried the weight of a prophecy that was not to be betrayed. His world was one of fierce competition, where each day was an opportunity to prove that one deserved their place, or risk losing everything. Philip was not an easy father. Harsh, strategic, and deeply ambitious, he did not allow affection to weaken his judgment. His love for Alexander was real, but never simple. He saw in his son a reflection of himself, a continuation, but also a challenge. Although he recognized him as heir, he would not give it to him as a gift. He wanted Alexander to earn it. And Alexander understood this. From a young age, he learned to observe his father with a mix of admiration, distrust, and the desire to surpass him. It was not just a relationship of blood. It was a silent struggle between two indomitable wills. Olympias, on the other hand, wove a different bond. She instilled in him from childhood that his destiny was sacred. She surrounded him with stories about Achilles, about Heracles, about heroes who had walked among men as demigods. She herself spoke in his ear, telling him that he was not like the others, that his blood was special, that his birth had not been the work of chance, but of a higher will. And Alexander believed it, not as a fantasy, but as an inner certainty, like a compass that would never abandon him. The boy showed signs of character long before he was old enough to wield a sword. He could not stand injustice, he hated to lose, and he had a memory as sharp as a blade. It is said that as a child, upon hearing an old man read aloud the verses of Homer, he wept with rage when he realized that he could not fight alongside Achilles in the Trojan War. For many, This would have been only a sign of childish imagination. For Alexander, it was an awakening. If he could not fight with the heroes of the past, then he would make the future speak of him as one of them. His education was carefully designed. First, he learned letters, music, and horsemanship. Then, at 13 years old, his father summoned the greatest thinker of the Greek world, Aristotle. For years, the philosopher trained the prince in logic, ethics, medicine, geography, and metaphysics. Together, they studied in the grove of Mieza, far from the noise of the court, in a retreat where ideas were as important as weapons. But although he learned about the soul, the stars, and the supreme good, Alexander never stopped keeping his feet firmly on the ground. He wanted to know how the world worked, because he planned to conquer it. These were not just words. From the age of 14, he began to take an active part in politics and war. He was not a decorative prince. Philip sent him on royal missions, tested him on the battlefield, and although sometimes he held him back, he could not deny his skill. Alexander did not only learn quickly, he dazzled. On one of those first occasions, he tamed a wild horse in front of the entire court. While everyone else failed, he noticed that the animal feared its own shadow. He changed position, calmed the animal, mounted it, and from then on, that horse, Bucephalus, would be his faithful companion until death. The scene was revealing. He was not just a brave boy. He was someone capable of seeing what others could not see. And that, beyond lineage or education, was what began to unsettle everyone around him. In the corridors of the palace, murmurs grew. Some saw in him a natural heir, an evolution of Philip's project. Others perceived him as a precocious threat, too brilliant, too aware of himself. Even among the Macedonian generals and nobles, divided loyalties emerged. Because Alexander, even without intending to, began to outshine those around him. But the young prince was still in formation. Conflicts, betrayals, alliances awaited him, and a destiny that, although it already seemed written in the signs of the sky, still had to be conquered day by day, battle by battle, word by word. What happened next was not immediate, but it was inevitable. The fire that accompanied him at birth never went out. It only needed time. And one more spark. And that spark would not take long to arrive. Because while Alexander grew between books and spears, an imposing, decisive figure continued to carve his path with an iron fist and a gaze that embraced all of Greece. His father, Philip, still had plans, and Alexander still had to walk under his shadow, although not for long. The young prince of Pella. As time went by, that child born amidst omens and legends began leaving the sheltered halls of the palace to venture into the real world, the one that stretched beyond the marble columns and the decorated ceilings of Pella. What began as a childhood forged among symbols and expectations slowly turned into a conscious, almost meticulous preparation for greatness. Alexander was not being educated as a passive heir awaiting his destiny, but as someone who sought it with clenched teeth and a burning soul. Everything around him seemed to be there to shape him: the teachers, the legends, the dangers. Every element of his surroundings acted as a mirror, reflecting possibilities, reminding him that mediocrity was not an option. From a very young age, he learned to live between two forces that molded him slowly, as if over a slow fire. On one hand, the military severity of his father, King Philip, a born strategist whose gaze could turn a conversation into an examination. On the other, the spiritual and emotional intensity of his mother, Olympias, who, with her esoteric beliefs, her nocturnal rituals, and her supernatural view of the world, enveloped him in an atmosphere where the invisible was as real as swords. At that crossroads, Alexander was shaped by a mixture of logic and faith, of cold calculation and burning mysticism, becoming something that not even his own parents fully knew how to handle. At the age of 7, he began his formal education, under the rigorous supervision of Leonidas, a tutor chosen by Philip to harden him. Unlike the gentle pedagogues who softened the childhood of noble children, Leonidas was a soldier before he was a teacher. He did not tolerate softness, avoided flattery, and believed that the body should be trained as if every day were the eve of war. Alexander soon learned to sleep little, eat only what was necessary, endure the cold of dawn, and withstand the harshness of physical training without complaint. It was then that he began to forge his endurance, not only of body but of will. Years later, when his soldiers were fainting while crossing deserts or climbing impossible mountains, he would keep walking at the front, because since childhood he had learned that a leader does not demand what he cannot give. But not everything was iron and discipline. At the same time, he nurtured himself with the beauty of Homeric poems, with music lessons, with the analysis of philosophical works, and with the learning of foreign languages. The Macedonian court, although military, valued Hellenic culture, and Alexander, with an inexhaustible curiosity, absorbed knowledge with the same fervor with which he wielded a sword. From a very early age, he showed a particular fascination with Achilles. He read about him, studied him, quoted him. It was not a simple childish admiration for a heroic character. It was a sort of spiritual bond, an obsession that would accompany him throughout his life. It is said that he slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow, and that when he rode, he imagined that the hoofbeats of his horse echoed like those of the warriors on the plains of Troy. The moment that would mark a before and after in his training came when Philip decided to hire Aristotle as his personal tutor. The philosopher from Stagira, disciple of Plato, and one of the brightest minds of the Greek world, accepted the task with conditions. One of them was that a private school be built for him in a secluded sanctuary in Mieza, surrounded by gardens, columns, and peaceful paths, where teaching could flow free from the tensions of the palace. There, among the whispers of the trees and the murmuring of the streams, Alexander learned to look at the world with deeper eyes. It was not only about conquering lands, but about understanding them. Aristotle taught him philosophy, politics, rhetoric, anatomy, astronomy, zoology, and an almost scientific view of the universe. But he also passed on to him the importance of logical thinking, the ethics of just action, and the value of observation. This complemented the impetuous spirit of the prince, offering him tools to think beyond the moment and to imagine structures more enduring than a simple victory in battle. Alexander began to consider that his role in the world was not only that of a king or a general, but that of a transformer. And although time would give him reasons to separate ideologically from his teacher, he would always carry with him that mark of thought as a silent weapon. At the same time, in the inner corridors of the court, conflicts did not stop growing. His relationship with his father, though marked by respect, was beginning to grow tense. Philip was a pragmatic man, more focused on political alliances and on consolidating Macedonian power than on dreams of glory. Alexander, on the other hand, aspired to a heroic ideal, to a fusion of myth and reality that his father considered dangerous. The young man challenged him through gestures, words, and attitudes. It was as if from very early on, he felt that he had to build his identity in contrast to the paternal figure, that he could only shine if he broke free from the mold that had created him. The court was full of rumors. People spoke of the excessive influence of Olympias, of the envy of Philip's other children, of the generals who were beginning to look with suspicion at the rise of the young prince. But Alexander did not allow himself to be intimidated. He actively participated in strategic meetings, argued with senior officers, and intervened in internal disputes with a maturity that astonished everyone. He was not a privileged child pretending to be important. From a very young age, he was a central figure in Macedonian politics, and his presence was beginning to shape decisions. At the age of 16, Philip left for a campaign in Thrace and appointed Alexander as regent of Macedonia. It was the first time the young man ruled in his father's absence, and he did not do so timidly. In that short period, he crushed a rebellion in the region of Maidi, seized a city, renamed it with his own name, Alexandropolis, and made it clear that he did not need supervision to act effectively. News of his achievements spread quickly, and while many hailed him as a worthy heir, others began to fear that his ambition might have no limits. But perhaps the scene that best reflects the essence of the young prince was that of Bucephalus. A wild, untamable horse had been brought to the court. No one could mount it. The most experienced riders were thrown to the ground one after another. Philip, exasperated, ordered it to be taken away. Alexander, who had been watching in silence, asked for permission to try. They laughed at him, thinking it was madness, but he had seen something others had not. The animal was not aggressive. It was fearful. It was afraid of its own shadow. Alexander turned it toward the sun, caressed it, mounted it, and mastered it. Philip, astonished, said in a trembling voice, "My son, seek a kingdom that matches your greatness, because Macedonia will not be enough for you." That phrase, spoken between pride and premonition, lingered in the air like a prophecy, because Alexander, even without a crown, was already thinking in terms that went beyond the mountains of his homeland. Every gesture of his, every word, every movement was preparation for something vaster, greater, more impossible. He did not need maps to know his world was small, nor prophecies to sense that the time to act was approaching. Meanwhile, Philip continued expanding his influence in the Greek world, but his steps, increasingly determined, were beginning to distance him from his son. The tension accumulated in the royal family would soon reach its peak, and when blood was shed, nothing would ever be the same again. The shadow of Philip II. As Alexander matured, with a mind sharpened by philosophy and a body hardened by war, the figure of his father began to grow around him like an inevitable shadow, a colossus of flesh and ambition who dominated the political scene of his time. With a mix of fierce pragmatism, rough charisma, and relentless determination, Philip II was not only the king of Macedonia, he was the architect of a new order in the Greek world, a strategist whose talent for war was only matched by his ability to manipulate alliances, break wills, and turn enemies into vassals. While the Greeks were still debating democratic ideals and the remnants of dying republics, Philip was quietly building an empire. His project was no improvisation. He had reformed the army, reorganized the Macedonian phalanx, introduced lighter weapons, longer spears, and above all, an almost inhuman discipline. Under his command, Macedonia went from being a marginal land to becoming the dominant power of Greece. And although glory shone intensely upon his crown, not everyone celebrated his rise. In Athens, in Thebes, in Corinth, intellectuals and strategists saw him as a barbarian with Hellenic manners, an invader disguised as a statesman. But no one could deny his results. With a blend of aggressive diplomacy and crushing military victories, Philip achieved what entire generations of Greeks had failed to do: unite the city-states, at least formally, under a single cause. He founded the League of Corinth, an alliance that, at least on paper, made Greece a common political body. The stated goal was to confront Persia, to avenge the offenses of centuries past, and to take the war across the sea. But beneath that collective purpose lay something more personal: absolute control over all decisions. Alexander watched all of this closely. He was no longer a child. His active participation in military campaigns, his capacity for leadership, and the admiration he inspired among certain sectors of the army began to be viewed with suspicion in the circles close to his father. Although Philip appreciated his abilities, he knew that a figure too brilliant could become dangerous. Between them there was a subtle tension, never fully expressed, that revealed itself in gestures, in prolonged silences, in the calculated choice of words. It was the classic story of a son beginning to equal his father, and a father unwilling to yield the center of the stage so easily. But it was not only about generational rivalry. There was a deeper problem: the question of lineage. Alexander was the son of Olympias, princess of the kingdom of Epirus, a proud and deeply religious woman who had never felt comfortable in the Macedonian court. Philip, although he had respected her in the past, had long been drifting away from her. His relationships with other women became increasingly public, and his marriage decisions began to carry a clear political intent. When he decided to marry a young Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice, a name that would later spark a controversy over identity, the conflict stopped being symbolic. The marriage meant more than a simple union. It was a political gesture that cast doubt on Alexander's position as legitimate heir. At a banquet during the wedding celebrations, an incident occurred that many would remember with astonishment. Attalus, a relative of Philip's new wife, raised his cup and asked the gods to grant the king a legitimate son, meaning one who was Macedonian by both parents. Alexander, furious, threw his cup and accused the man of insulting his mother. The tension escalated, shouts were exchanged, and Philip, in a fit of rage or drunkenness, attempted to attack his own son with sword in hand, only to fall to the ground because of his limp. Alexander looked at him with contempt and said, "Does he intend to cross into Asia with this gait, when he cannot cross this hall without falling?" That incident marked a temporary rupture. Alexander and Olympias left the court, withdrawing to Epirus. The distance between father and son became public, and for a time silence surrounded everything. But soon politics once again imposed itself. Philip, focused on his campaigns, needed stability at home. Alexander, aware that a direct confrontation at that moment would place him in a vulnerable position, agreed to return. They reconciled, at least in appearance. But the wound was there. And in the corridors of power, personal cracks become political fissures. Meanwhile, Philip moved forward with his most ambitious plan: the invasion of Persia. It was a dream shared by many Hellenes, but now under the direction of a single man. Philip had shown that he could subdue Greece. Now he sought to prove that he could challenge the greatest empire of the known world. He was preparing a grand expedition, reorganizing his forces, and sending envoys to secure routes and loyalties. It was the project that should have definitively consecrated him as the great conqueror of his age. But fate, ever restless, was already weaving another scene in parallel. Amid the preparations, Philip organized a public ceremony to celebrate the marriage of his daughter to the king of Epirus, the brother of Olympias, an alliance designed to pacify family ties and secure the loyalty of a key frontier. The celebration would take place in the theater of Aegae, the ancient Macedonian capital. A majestic parade was prepared, a solemn procession with generals, nobles, and foreign ambassadors. Philip, at the forefront, walked like a god among men, without an escort, with the haughty confidence of one who believes he has mastered all variables. And then, in the brightest instant of his glory, the shadow reached him. A young man named Pausanias, a member of the king's personal guard, lunged at him with a dagger and killed him with a single thrust. The crowd went into panic. The assassin was killed almost immediately, but questions began to multiply. Had he acted alone? Was it a personal revenge, as some claimed? Or was it part of a deeper conspiracy? Versions varied. Some said that Pausanias had been dishonored by another courtier and that the king had ignored his complaint. Others suggested he had been manipulated, perhaps by Olympias, perhaps by a faction seeking to hasten the succession. The truth would never be known for certain. The only clear fact was that Philip, the great unifier, the brilliant strategist, the absolute king, fell at the highest point of his power. The death of the father changed everything. The throne was left empty, and the world suddenly seemed to hold its breath. And there he was, Alexander, only 20 years old, watching from the shadows as the world his father had built opened before his feet. It was the moment he had been waiting for, though never like this, never so soon, never with such a burden. The shadow of Philip was fading, but the weight of his legacy was only beginning to fall upon his shoulders. And among the dry blood of the theater and the echoes of a leaderless kingdom, the young man prepared to take the step that would transform him forever. The rise after the assassination. The blood had not yet dried on the stones of the theater of Igas when suspicions began to multiply like shapeless shadows. The corpse of Philip II, murdered in the middle of the celebration, and before the astonished gaze of the entire Macedonian nobility, still lay on the ground when intrigues were already being woven, ambitions were being sharpened, and old quarrels were reactivated, quarrels that until then had remained dormant under the iron authority of the king. The sudden and scandalous death was not only the end of a man, it was the opening of a deep crack in the political structure that he had built with so much effort. And there was Alexander, standing before the body of his father, watching with a mixture of shock and calculation. He was barely 20 years old. He was young, yes, but not naive. He had spent his whole life preparing for this moment, although he had never imagined it would arrive in this way, with a dagger driven into the heart of the king, in the middle of a parade, without wars or battles, without succession ceremonies. The throne was now empty, but the vacuum of power waits for no one. In the politics of the time, he who hesitated died. He who delayed was left behind. Alexander knew it. The time for mourning would be brief. The rise to power had to be immediate. The first thing he did was to secure the support of the army. Without the loyalty of the generals and the troops, any claim to the throne would have been a dangerous illusion. Alexander went directly to the phalanx, to the hard core of the soldiers who had fought under the orders of his father, and faced them without pretenses. He reminded them of their common blood, their training, the battles they had already shared together when he was still a teenager. He spoke to them as a leader who had grown up among them, who knew the sweat of the battlefield, not as a decorative noble but as a true warrior. He did not promise them riches, but glory, and he convinced them. He was proclaimed King of Macedonia with a speed that left those who had planned to dispute the succession astonished. But the crown, although it already rested upon his brow, was not a guarantee of stability. Internal enemies soon began to move. Some nobles considered him too young, others that his blood was tainted by the Epirote ancestry of his mother, and others simply envied his natural ascendancy over the army. And Olympias, as always, played her own game. From the shadows, she wove alliances, eliminated obstacles, and strengthened the rise of her son, like a lioness, protecting the cub that would one day reign over the entire pride. The new king did not wait for rumors to become plots. He acted with surgical speed. He executed or exiled all those he considered a direct threat. Among them, Cleopatra Eurydice, the last wife of Philip, and her newborn daughter. Olympias, according to some sources, was even more brutal. She ordered that the young mother and her daughter be killed in their own chambers, as a symbolic act that would remove any doubt about the line of succession. Alexander did not intervene. Perhaps he did not order it, but he did not prevent it either. In those first days, he learned that the throne is not a pedestal. It is a minefield where each step can mean ruin if not taken with decision. Macedonia, however, was not an island. The news of Philip's assassination spread like wildfire throughout the Greek world. In Athens, in Thebes, in Thessaly, the cities that had recently been subdued or integrated into the League of Corinth saw in the death of the king an opportunity. They believed that the young heir, inexperienced and pressured on multiple fronts, would not withstand the tension. Rebellions began to germinate. To the south, the polis dreamed of regaining their independence. To the north, barbarian tribes tested the limits of the borders. Alexander, with only a few days in power, found himself surrounded by fire on all sides. But instead of barricading himself, he launched himself to the front. The first step was to secure Thessaly, key to controlling the passage to the south. His army moved with a speed that took everyone by surprise. He crossed Mount Olympus with risky maneuvers and presented himself before the rebellious cities before they could organize a serious defense. The message was clear. The new king would not wait for conflict to arrive at his door. He would seek it with sword in hand. One by one, the cities began to surrender. Alexander did not only act as an efficient military man, he behaved as someone who understood the value of symbolism. In each gesture, in each word spoken before the leaders of the polis, he made it clear that his reign would not be a mere continuation of that of Philip, but something more ambitious, deeper, more personal. He did not only wish to inherit a kingdom, he wanted to shape the world. Upon his return to Macedonia, there were still unsettled matters. The northern tribes, traditional enemies of the kingdom, took advantage of the uncertainty to attack. Alexander organized a punitive expedition without delay. He crossed the Danube, defeated the Getae, subdued the Illyrians, and returned victorious before winter could overtake him. That campaign, brief but decisive, consolidated his reputation as an unstoppable commander. He was no longer the son of the murdered king. He was the young monarch who fiercely defended the legacy of his dynasty. As he suppressed internal revolts, he began to project his vision outward. He gathered in Corinth the members of the Pan-Hellenic League that his father had founded. He demanded that they recognize him as supreme leader of the campaign against Persia. Some doubted, others resisted in silence, but in the end, all yielded. Because before them there was not an insecure boy, but a warrior with the gaze of someone who had already tasted the edge of power and had accepted it. In the assembly, Alexander was confirmed as hegemon of the Greeks in the Crusade against the Persian Empire, and although the title repeated the one that his father had held, the content was different. What in Philip had been a strategic plan, in Alexander began to take the form of an almost religious undertaking, a war not only for revenge, but for immortality. The new king took a moment to return to Pella. There, surrounded by the walls where he had grown up, he observed the world he was leaving behind. He had sealed alliances, crushed enemies, and consolidated his position in barely a year. But he was not yet satisfied. All of that, in his eyes, was merely the prologue. What he desired was beyond the sea, in eastern lands, in cities he had never set foot in battles that had not yet been fought. As winter settled over Macedonia, Alexander began preparations. He gathered maps, called his generals, adjusted his army. But beyond logistics, what was taking shape was something different. The idea that his life should not be limited to ruling, but to transcending. He had taken power amid corpses and betrayals, had defended it with blood, and now he was preparing to transform it into an instrument that would open the doors of history for him. The world he knew was no longer enough. What was to come next was not a campaign, but a destiny. And the clock of the universe had already begun to count. The roar of Greece. The echo of Philip's death had faded in the mountains of the north, and Alexander was already ruling Macedonia with a firm hand. But stability was never complete, especially in a world as fragmented and proud as the Greek one. The apparent unity of the polis, achieved through the League of Corinth, had been more of an illusion imposed by force than a pact based on true loyalties. Beneath the surface of oaths and signatures, old rivalries boiled, resentments accumulated, and a latent desire to shake off the Macedonian yoke simmered. The news of Philip's death had spread with the speed of lightning. Despite Alexander's quick coronation, many city-states saw in the young king an opportunity. They thought he did not yet have the necessary maturity, that he lacked the political experience of his father, and that his troops, although loyal, were vulnerable to the instability of an early succession. Some even believed he would not survive the first months. And so, little by little, the Greek ground began to tremble again. In Athens, oratory was igniting the squares, speeches multiplied. The celebrated Demosthenes, an implacable opponent of Macedonian hegemony, was taking the stage once more. With every word, he fed the hope that Hellenic freedom could rise again from the ashes. In other corners, such as Thebes, the fervor was even more dangerous. There they were not content with talking. There, swords were already being sharpened. Thebes, proud, ancient, and fierce, had for centuries been one of the most powerful cities of Greece. Its humiliation at the hands of Philip had been an open wound that had never fully healed. And now, with the figure of the new king still in the process of consolidating, the opportunity seemed perfect to challenge him. What began as a mild protest soon turned into an uprising. The local leaders began mobilizing the population. Squadrons were armed, the walls were reinforced, and a proclamation was sent to other cities. The time had come to free Greece from Macedonian rule. As tension grew, Alexander decided to act. He did not wait for the rebellion to consolidate. He did not ask for explanations, nor did he open negotiation tables. He gathered his army and marched south with a speed that bewildered everyone. He crossed Thessaly in a few days, traversed the mountain passes with the precision of a surgeon, and appeared before the gates of Thebes before the city could finish preparing for war. His message was clear and brutal. Insurrection was not an option. But the Thebans, emboldened, did not back down. They refused to surrender. They trusted in their strength, in their walls, in the supposed support they expected from Athens and other neighboring polis. And there, at that very crossroads of decisions, the fate of the city was sealed. What followed was one of the most relentless actions of Alexander's life. He ordered a total assault. His troops attacked from all flanks. The Theban resistance, though brave, was insufficient against the drive of a professional and motivated army. The streets ran red with blood. Homes were set ablaze. Temples were violated by the fury of war. And when the sun set, Thebes no longer existed as it had been known. Alexander did not stop at conquest. He ordered the city to be razed to its foundations. More than 6,000 citizens died in combat. 30,000 were sold as slaves. The sacred buildings, with few exceptions, were destroyed. He spared only the house of Pindar, the poet, and the altars dedicated to Dionysus, as if wishing to leave a testimony that even in destruction there was room for memory. The message could not have been clearer. Any city that challenged his authority would meet the same fate. The consequences of the act were devastating, not only for Thebes, but for all of Greece. The roar that had risen with hope from the squares drowned in fear. Athens, which until then had flirted with the idea of rebelling, immediately stepped back. In a turn that many saw as shameful, it sent envoys to pay homage to the new king. Other polis did the same. Alexander's authority, sealed with blood and fire, was affirmed beyond any discussion, and peace, no matter how artificial, settled like a layer of silence over the Greek map. But that act of harshness was not just a display of power. It was also a strategic move. Alexander knew he was about to leave Greece to embark on a campaign that would take him far away for years. He could not afford to leave an unstable territory behind him. He needed every city, every leader, every citizen to know that his word was law, that his decision would not be questioned, and he achieved it. In the months that followed, the war machine began to turn with greater force. New soldiers were recruited, supplies were reorganized, communication routes were strengthened, envoys were sent to the Ionian cities under Persian control. Alexander was not only preparing an invasion, he was preparing a movement that involved logistics, ideology, and a narrative designed to sustain the impossible. The young king, who only 1 year earlier had had to consolidate his throne in the midst of conspiracies and rebellions, was now recognized as the absolute leader of Greece, as the new hegemon of the Hellenic world, and as the figure who would carry out a long-awaited mission of revenge. to settle accounts with the empire that, centuries earlier, had burned Athens and defiled the temples of the Greek world. Alexander, in his inner self, knew it. He had achieved what many kings had not even dared to dream. But in his gaze, there was no complacency. Thebes had been a warning, but also a turning point. It was no longer only about maintaining what he had inherited, but about beginning to build something different, something that did not yet have a clear shape, but that pulsed in his mind like a call impossible to ignore. As the columns of smoke dissolved into the Theban sky and the names of the fallen were lost in the wind, Alexander turned his eyes to the east. Beyond the Aegean, beyond the Hellespont, there awaited an immense, hostile, and unknown world. A world that, until then, had seemed beyond the reach of any Greek man.
But he did not consider himself just any man.
And the time to cross the border was drawing nearer with every step. The Great Crusade against Persia. In the spring of the year 334 before Christ, the young king of Macedonia, only 22 years old, began the journey that would mark the start of one of the most ambitious, daring, and decisive undertakings in the history of humanity. His army, although small compared to the forces they would face, was made up of veterans hardened by previous campaigns, men who had fought under the command of Philip and who now placed their trust in the son, more out of respect for his military genius than for the weight of his family name. There were about 35,000 soldiers, a mixture of Macedonians, Thracians, allied Greeks, and mercenaries, accompanied by several thousand horsemen, carpenters, engineers, doctors, astronomers, cartographers, and even poets. This was not simply a military expedition. It was a controlled migration into the unknown. Alexander crossed the Hellespont, the strait that separates Europe from Asia, with the solemnity of a ritual. He carried with him an annotated copy of the Iliad and a handful of Macedonian soil. According to the chronicles, he was the first to disembark, throwing his spear into the ground with a symbolic gesture, as if taking possession of that continent in the name of the gods and of his own destiny. The gesture was not improvised. It followed a logic of sacred theatricality that would accompany him throughout his life. For Alexander was not moved solely by strategy or political ambition. He felt driven by a greater vision, something that combined myth, history, and faith into a single energy. The Persian Empire, his declared objective, was no minor adversary. It stretched from the shores of the Aegean Sea to the distant lands of India, and it was ruled by Darius III, a descendant of a long dynasty that for more than 2 centuries had dominated vast regions of the known world. Although in political decline, the empire maintained an impressive administrative structure, numerous armies, and a network of roads and fortresses that seemed unbreakable. In theory, Alexander was marching toward an impossible fight. But he, as so many times in his life, never believed in impossibilities. The official pretext for the invasion was clear: to avenge the wrongs committed by the Persians during the Greco-Persian Wars, when Xerxes had plundered Athens and desecrated Greek temples. This narrative, carefully recovered and amplified, served to give legitimacy to a campaign that, at its core, responded to a deeper and more personal drive. Alexander wanted to defeat the greatest empire of his time, not for simple historical revenge, but to merge with it, subdue it, and at the same time, absorb it, transforming himself into something new through the process. The first steps were cautious but firm. His army advanced along the coast of Asia Minor, taking Greek cities that for years had been under Persian control. Some welcomed him as a liberator, others offered resistance. In each case, Alexander showed an exceptional ability to alternate hardness with diplomacy, punishment with clemency, authority with charisma. He knew that his image needed to project something more than brute force. His intention was not simply to occupy territories, but to create a current of sympathy, a shared vision in which Greeks from Asia, Macedonians, and local peoples could see in him a legitimate leader. The cities that accepted his authority were reorganized, their satraps removed, their tributes redirected to the Macedonian cause. Those that resisted were taken by assault, plundered, and, on occasion, destroyed. But amid the conquests, Alexander made clear a pattern that would be repeated throughout his campaign. He never sought to annihilate the cultures he encountered, but to integrate them under his vision of empire. He allowed the continuity of local customs, respected temples, and presented himself as heir not only to the Greeks, but also to the ancient Oriental gods. His crusade was not that of a traditional conqueror, but that of someone who wanted to redraw the human map. The advance brought him to the gates of his first great military challenge, the Battle of the Granicus River. There, the Persian satraps had gathered a considerable force to stop him, confident that their position was unassailable. The Granicus, with its swift waters and irregular banks, offered a natural barrier that discouraged a direct crossing. But Alexander, after analyzing the terrain, decided to attack immediately. He ignored the suggestions of some of his generals, who advised waiting and seeking a safer crossing. That was not his style. When he saw the opportunity, he acted. The battle was brutal. Alexander personally led the charge, heading the elite cavalry. His spear broke the Persian formation with a combination of speed and precision that shattered the enemy lines. At one point, he was nearly killed, surrounded by enemies who recognized the young king in the midst of the fight. It was his bodyguard Clytus the Black who saved his life by cutting off the arm of a Persian officer who was about to kill him. That episode would be remembered as a warning of the price of exposure, but also as confirmation of Alexander's courage, for he did not command from the rear, but led from the front line. Victory at the Granicus had an immediate effect. The cities of the region, upon seeing the defeat of the satraps, began to open their gates. Sardis surrendered without a fight. Miletus was taken after a brief siege. Halicarnassus resisted longer, but eventually fell as well. Alexander advanced like a storm that gave no respite. Each city conquered reinforced his legend. Each victory fed the idea that the young king was touched by a higher power. In essence, what was beginning to be built was more than a series of conquests. It was a myth in real time, a kind of living narrative that accompanied the army and drove it forward. Alexander was not just a king among others. He was the center of an epic. And that story, built with carefully chosen gestures, decisions, and symbols, was perhaps his most powerful weapon. Because where his soldiers saw a commander, his enemies began to see a force they could not fully understand. In the midst of the campaigns, he also began to forge relationships with local leaders, to integrate young Persian nobles into his court, to establish ties that would go far beyond simple military subordination. His vision of empire, even in its earliest stage, was beginning to blur the boundaries between victor and vanquished, between East and West. It was not complete integration, nor was it immediate. But the seed was already there. As he advanced along the southern coast of Asia Minor, each step brought him closer to the heart of the Persian Empire. Darius, until then distant, was beginning to understand that this young king was not simply another Greek rebel. He was a real threat, a storm that grew with each city that fell, with each soldier that joined his cause. Preparations for the great confrontation began, but Alexander was in no hurry. He knew that time played in his favor. The fear, admiration, and surprise that his figure inspired were already acting as a silent form of domination. And while the men slept in their tents, in the improvised camps after each conquest, he remained awake, studying maps, questioning prisoners, listening to the stories of travelers, drawing in his mind an empire that did not yet exist, but that each day became more possible. For Alexander, each battle won was only a step, and his gaze, fixed on the horizon, had not yet stopped. The Thunder of Granicus. The land of Asia trembled under the boots of thousands of men advancing with steady steps, to the rhythm of a war drum that blended with the roar of the wind. After weeks of marching, brief sieges, and cities that opened their gates without much resistance, Alexander had led his army to the banks of the Granicus River, a point apparently insignificant on the maps, but one that destiny had reserved as the stage for the first real clash between the Greek world and the military heart of the Persian Empire. Spring had only just begun to burst across the landscape of Asia Minor, and the Granicus flowed cold from the mountains, swollen by the melting snow and days of rain. The waters, swift and treacherous, formed a natural frontier, a perfect trap for any army attempting to cross them in front of a well-positioned enemy. And there, stationed on the eastern bank, were the Persian satraps, the regional governors sent by Darius to contain the Macedonian advance. They had numerical superiority, heavy cavalry, and a higher position. And, above all, the certainty that no sensible commander would dare attack under such conditions. But Alexander had never moved within the limits of what others considered sensible. On the night before the battle, he met with his generals. Parmenion, his most veteran commander, a man of unquestionable experience and well-learned caution, advised him to wait. It was better to look for a safer ford, cross at another point of the river, and avoid a frontal confrontation. Alexander listened attentively, without interrupting. When everyone had spoken, he stood up calmly and simply said they would attack at dawn. The river was not a barrier. It was an opportunity. Waiting would only give the enemy time to strengthen their position. Surprise was his best ally, and when he withdrew, no one dared to contradict him. At daybreak, the mist slowly lifted from the water, and the reflections of the rising sun gave the current a metallic gleam that seemed to foretell the clash of weapons. The Macedonian trumpets sounded sharply, tearing the air. Alexander personally led the vanguard. His helmet shone in the rays of light. He rode Bucephalus, his lifelong horse, nervous and powerful. Around him, the elite cavalry formed in silence, ready to follow him in what seemed like madness. The crossing was an act of pure will. The waters pushed violently, the ground was slippery, and the Persians hurled projectiles from the opposite shore. Spears flew. The mud swallowed the feet of the infantrymen. But Alexander, instead of slowing down, sped up. Seeing his men hesitate in the middle of the torrent, he raised his spear, shouted with force, and threw himself forward. It was an image taken from epic tales. The leader, visible, almost defiant, cutting through the river as if the gods had promised that the waters would part for him. And for a moment, it seemed they did. The impact on the shore was brutal. The Macedonian troops, disorganized by the crossing, faced a Persian line well-positioned, with cavalry and archers ready. The fight turned into a confused mass of bodies, cries, and steel. Alexander went straight for the strongest point of the enemy, the elite Persian cavalry protecting the center. There, in the middle of the chaos, he recognized Mithridates, the son-in-law of King Darius, and charged at him. In the clash, Alexander's spear pierced his breastplate with surgical violence, knocking him down in a single blow. The scene completely shifted the enemy's morale, but his audacity almost cost him his life. While still fighting in the center, 2 Persian officers managed to surround him. One of them raised his scimitar and brought down a direct blow towards the king's head. Alexander dodged instinctively, but the blade cut through his helmet and tore his scalp. It was then that Clytus the Black, his trusted bodyguard, intervened decisively. With a single stroke, he severed the attacker's arm before he could strike again. In the middle of the battle, that action not only saved Alexander, it sealed a symbolic moment, one of those scenes that forever mark the bond between commander and soldier. The battle began to tilt. Once the crossing was secured and the Persian line began to falter, Alexander ordered the full advance of the heavy infantry. The phalanx, with its endless spears and wall of shields, advanced like a machine that nothing could stop. The Persians, already disorganized and with broken morale, began to retreat. Many were cut down during the flight. Others drowned trying to cross the same river they had thought moments before to be impassable for their enemies. When the battle ended, The field was covered with bodies. Thousands of Persians lay dead or dying. The Macedonians had also suffered losses, but the victory was complete. Alexander rode across the terrain in silence, his gaze tense, aware that what had just happened was more than a military victory. It was a message. The bodies of the highest-ranking Persian officers were treated with honor, as a sign of respect towards a worthy enemy. The Greek prisoners who had fought as mercenaries for the Persians, however, did not share the same fate. Alexander considered them traitors, Greeks who had sold their swords to the invader. He had them chained and sent as slaves to Macedonia, so that they would work the land and remember every day that one cannot serve two worlds at the same time. The captured Persians, on the other hand, were treated with relative humanity. Many were released under oath, others were integrated into the local administration. This policy of selective punishment and strategic clemency was beginning to emerge as one of the distinctive marks of the young conqueror. His war was personal, yes, but it was not blind. Every action had a purpose, every punishment, a message. The victory at Granicus had an immediate effect throughout Asia Minor. The Greek cities under Persian rule began to declare themselves in favor of Alexander. The smaller fortresses surrendered without resistance. The surviving satraps fled inland, fearing that the next battle would not grant them the same fortune. And in the ears of Darius III, in the distant capital of Susa, the first disturbing rumors began to arrive. A young king had crossed the sea, had defeated his generals, and was marching with a confidence that did not seem of this world. For Alexander, however, this was only the first stage, a test overcome. Granicus was not his destiny, but the starting point of something much greater. While his men celebrated, he wrote letters, planned routes, and sent envoys. He knew that each day gained against the enemy had to be used as if it were the last. The war he had started was not a territorial campaign. It was a total transformation of the balance of power, a break with the previous order, an assault on the very heart of history. And the best, or the worst, was yet to come. The heart of Asia Minor. The victory at the Granicus had been like a lightning bolt in the middle of the night. Sudden, dazzling, irreversible. Alexander had not only defeated a Persian army on hostile territory, he had shown that the foundations of the greatest empire on earth could be shaken by a force that was younger, more agile, and above all, more determined. The Greek cities along the coast, which for decades had lived under the rule of Persian satraps, began to look at Alexander with a mixture of fear and hope. Fear, because the new king was not indulgent toward betrayal. Hope, because his troops carried the promise of liberation. Sardis was the first to surrender without a fight. The ancient capital of Lydia, one of the most prestigious cities in Western Asia, handed its keys to Alexander as one might offer a trophy to a vengeful god. The Persian commander who defended it, seeing that his position could not be held, simply abandoned the city. Alexander, in a gesture characteristic of his vision of conquest, did not destroy the city, nor impose a new order through violence. Instead, he returned part of their autonomy to the citizens, reorganized the administration with local officials, and built an altar to Zeus as a symbol of Hellenic restoration. It was his way of making clear that he did not come as a plunderer, but as someone who understood politics as an art of persuasion. From Sardis, the army moved toward the coast, stopping at Miletus, a city older than Athens itself, cradle of philosophers and sailors, but also a key piece in the Persian defensive network. There, Alexander faced a different situation. The inhabitants were divided, and the city had a strong garrison as well as the support of the Persian fleet. The battle was brief but intense. Alexander, aware that he could not compete with the Persians at sea, prevented the enemy fleet from landing reinforcements. His troops surrounded the city by land, and after several days of siege, Miletus fell. Alexander allowed its inhabitants to keep their property and their freedom, although he confiscated the arsenals and took control of the port. Every decision seemed designed not only to secure the present, but also to prepare for what was yet to come. But not all cities offered their surrender so easily. Halicarnassus, located in a fortified position and governed by Memnon of Rhodes, one of the most skilled strategists in the service of Persia, put up hard, persistent, almost desperate resistance. Memnon understood that stopping Alexander there could change the course of the entire campaign, so he turned the city into a trap. He ordered the construction of underground tunnels, reinforced the walls, and prepared ambushes in every alleyway. For weeks, the Macedonians were forced to fight step by step, house by house, against an enemy who would not yield to either tactical superiority or the pressure of time. Alexander, far from growing impatient, once again showed his capacity for adaptation. He introduced new siege techniques, reinforced his machinery, and combined frontal assaults with flanking maneuvers. Finally, when the position became untenable, Memnon ordered the evacuation of much of the population and set the city ablaze. It was a desperate yet calculated gesture. He preferred to leave ruins rather than allow Halicarnassus to fall intact. Although Alexander managed to occupy the city, he found little more than smoke and ashes. Nevertheless, he showed no sign of frustration. He knew that even an incomplete victory, when built on heroic resistance, could become an emblem for the morale of his men. And his army, in fact, was growing not only in numbers but also in cohesion. The marches through the lands of southern Asia Minor were hard, marked by heat, humidity, and the complex topography of mountainous regions and irregular coastlines. But Alexander shared the hardships with his soldiers. He walked alongside them. He slept in the same camps. He ate the same rations. He did not command from a distance, but inspired from close at hand. This closeness was not a public relations strategy. It was his way of life. And it was this intimate relationship with his army that kept him strong during the most tense moments of the campaign. As he advanced through Caria, Lycia, and Pamphylia, Alexander encountered less resistance. The cities, warned by the fate of Halicarnassus, began to surrender before the Macedonian army even raised its standards at their gates. But Alexander did not take these surrenders as servile gestures. He studied them. Each had its own dynamics, its political system, its internal balance. He did not impose a single form of control, but designed solutions for each case. In some, he kept the local government. In others, he established garrisons. In others still, he left temples intact to gain legitimacy among the priests. He was a conqueror, yes, but also a reformer. At this point in the campaign, something began to become evident. Alexander was no longer just the leader of a military expedition. He had become the administrator of a complex network of territories, an organizer of relationships between peoples, cultures, and languages. Although he marched eastward in search of total victory, his gaze was increasingly focused on how to govern what had already been conquered. And he did so with a strange and therefore powerful combination of force and diplomacy, of threat and promise. However, the most revealing thing lay not in the military victories or in the treaties signed, but in what was beginning to take shape within Alexander's own mind. As he crossed mountains and passes, as he conversed with local sages and studied the customs of the peoples he encountered, he began to transform. He no longer conceived of himself solely as king of Macedonia, nor even as commander of the Greeks. He was beginning to envision himself as a universal figure, as someone destined to unite East and West under a single vision. It was not an idea crafted at a strategy table, but a feeling that grew within him with the force of a prophecy. The march toward Phrygia was less eventful in military terms, but significant in the symbolic sense. It was there that Alexander encountered the famous Gordian knot in the city of Gordion. Legend said that whoever could untie the knot of King Midas's chariot would be Lord of Asia. The knot was an impossible tangle, a cord so intricate that for centuries no one had been able to undo it. Alexander, after observing it for a moment, drew his sword and cut it in a single stroke. Some celebrated it as cleverness. Others criticized it as cheating. But the important thing was not the act itself, but its symbolic reading. The young king had just announced, without speaking a word, that his path would not respect the old rules. He would do whatever was necessary to open the gates of the world. And so, between myths defied and cities transformed, Alexander continued his march. The center of Asia Minor was already under his control, and the routes toward the heart of the empire were beginning to clear. But in the distance, beyond deserts and valleys, a powerful figure moved cautiously. Darius III, now fully aware of the approaching threat, was beginning to gather his forces. Alexander, however, did not seem unsettled. On the contrary, the greater the enemy became, the more the fire in his eyes burned. The Labyrinth of Gordion. Winter was beginning to make itself felt on the plains of Central Asia Minor when Alexander arrived in the city of Gordion, an ancient urban center marked by the echoes of legendary kings and symbols forgotten by time. There, where the land seemed to hold more memory than dust, there was an object wrapped in mystery, a relic carrying centuries of legends, whose meaning went far beyond the physical. It was the Gordian knot, a tangle of ropes tied to the yoke of an ancient ceremonial chariot, offered to the gods by Gordios, the mythical founder of the city, and, according to tradition, the first king of Phrygia. The oracle had been clear for generations. Whoever succeeded in untying that knot would conquer all of Asia. Alexander knew the story. He had heard it as a child from the lips of priests, soldiers, and philosophers. He knew that this object was not merely a sanctuary curiosity, but a test, a crossroads between the symbolic and the real, between the destiny told by the ancients and the world yet to be conquered. His arrival in Gordion was no coincidence. Although the military advance continued and strategic routes opened before him, Alexander understood that true power also required victories over the invisible, over myth, over prophecies, over the limits others placed upon themselves. The chariot was kept in the temple of Zeus, under religious guard, revered as if its wood still contained the soul of the past. When Alexander entered that sanctuary, the air was dense, almost motionless. The priests observed in silence. His generals accompanied him without speaking. It was a moment heavy with expectation. No one knew for sure how he would act. Some expected a solemn gesture, others perhaps a joke. But Alexander, true to his style, chose the exact center between action and symbol. For several minutes, he examined the knot. It was a compact tangle of twisted fibers, aged by centuries, with no visible beginning or end. Its design had resisted generations of eager hands, ambitious kings, and curious travelers. But Alexander, looking at it, understood that the challenge was not technical, but philosophical. The knot existed to be solved, and he had no intention of being stopped by a rope, by an oracle, or by the expectations of those who thought destiny bent only to those who waited. He drew his sword and, with a single stroke, cut the knot in two. The silence grew even deeper. Some murmured, others smiled. The legend did not say how the knot had to be untied, only that whoever managed to master it would rule Asia, and Alexander had done it, not through patience or conventional cunning, but with a decisive final act. For him, the message was clear. Traditional solutions were not enough in a world in transformation. If history offered impossible challenges, then the will must rewrite the rules of the game. That gesture, brief in duration but vast in resonance, marked a turning point, not only among his troops who saw in it a sign of destiny and of prophetic fulfillment, but also among his enemies, who began to understand that Alexander was not someone they could comprehend through their old categories. He was unpredictable, he was bold, and above all, he was effective. With that stroke, he had not only cut a knot, he had removed from his path a legacy of centuries, and had left behind those who believed that time must respect its own rhythms. After the ceremony, the army remained in Gordion for several weeks. Weather conditions made it difficult to advance eastward, and Alexander took advantage of that time to reorganize his forces, replenish supplies, and strengthen the garrisons of the cities already under his control. The waiting time, however, was not passive. Alexander received reports, analyzed routes, and observed enemy movements. His mind was never still. While his soldiers rested, he was already tracing the lines of the next campaign. During those days of pause, envoys also began arriving from the most distant regions of the Persian Empire. Some offered tribute, others sought pacts, and some simply wanted to buy time. Alexander listened to them all with courtesy, but in his gaze there was something beyond diplomacy. He was not there to negotiate over the scraps of a declining empire, but to take it whole. Every city that surrendered to him was a piece on the board, and every envoy who arrived with offerings confirmed to him that his name was beginning to resonate as an inevitable force. Meanwhile, on the other side of the continent, Darius III was beginning to prepare his response. The Persian king, until then distant, finally understood that the advancing threat was not just another incursion, nor a peripheral uprising that could be smothered with bureaucracy. Alexander had become a storm, and his next objective was the heart of the empire. But the most interesting thing was not only the reaction of the enemy, it was the way Alexander was transforming with each step. As he moved deeper into Asia, his figure ceased to be that of a simple Hellenic conqueror. His ideas expanded. His decisions took on a more universal dimension. Winning battles was no longer enough. He was now thinking about how to govern, how to unite peoples, how to leave a mark that would not fade when his armies crossed the next river. The gesture at Gordion was only the outward reflection of an inner change. Alexander was beginning to see himself as more than a king, more than a general, more than a political figure. His ambition was no longer limited to physical space. He wanted to be remembered in the memory of peoples, in future myths, in names that would survive the dust. For that, he had to build something greater than an empire. He had to build an idea. That is why every one of his gestures during those days seemed to be thought of in historical terms, from the way he treated conquered peoples to how he organized coins, taxes, or local laws. Power for him was not a goal achieved, but an instrument in constant use, a tool that had to be refined, shaped, and redirected at every step. When spring finally arrived, Alexander broke camp. The army, strengthened and confident, was ready to advance once more. The road eastward opened before them with all its promises and dangers. But this time, those who followed him were not marching behind just any king. They marched behind a man who, by cutting a simple knot, had shown that he did not intend to wait for destiny to choose him. He had decided to take it with the sword. The storm of Issus. In the autumn of the year 333 before Christ, while the rains began to drench the valleys of southern Asia Minor, the world prepared, without knowing it, to witness a clash that was not only military, but symbolic. Alexander of Macedonia, the young king advancing like an unstoppable tide from Europe, and Darius III, the monarch of an ancient empire whose royal blood carried the weight of centuries, were about to face each other for the first time. The setting was not a great city nor a sacred plain. It was a narrow passage between mountains and sea. The plain of Issus, a natural corridor wedged between the coast of the Gulf and the Taurus mountain range, where space, strategy, and destiny would collide with a violence that would resonate for centuries. After the campaign in Phrygia and his passage through Gordion, Alexander had directed his army toward Cilicia, crossing steep paths, passing through gorges, and facing an increasingly hostile climate. Fatigue was building among the ranks, but he showed no sign of weariness. He was convinced that Darius would not take long to act, and that he would do so with all the power that the Persian Empire could muster. What he did not yet know was that this moment was much closer than it seemed. Darius, for his part, had gathered a colossal force. Ancient sources speak of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, a number likely exaggerated, but the reality was that the Persian army far outnumbered the Macedonian one. It was a multi-ethnic force, with Bactrian cavalry, Median archers, Syrian infantry, Greek mercenaries, and an elite royal guard. Darius did not come to negotiate. He came to erase from the map that young man who dared to challenge the balance of the known world. However, he made a mistake that would change the course of history. He attempted to surprise Alexander from the rear, crossing the Amanus Mountains by difficult passes, and ended up trapped in narrow terrain, precisely where his numerical superiority could not be deployed. When Alexander learned that the Persian army had descended to the north of his position, he understood that the moment had arrived. He did not hesitate. He gathered his troops, reorganized them with millimetric precision, and marched toward Issus. There, under a sky covered with heavy clouds, between the raging sea and the dark hills, the two armies met. It was a scene charged with electricity, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The battle began at dawn, with the advance of the Persian infantry over the Pinarus River, a stream that, though small, marked a natural line between both fronts. Alexander placed his phalanx at the center, the hypaspists and peltasts on the flanks, and his cavalry, led by himself, on the right wing, opposite the point where Darius stood, protected by his personal guard and his war chariot. What followed was a dance of maneuvers and courage. While the phalanx resisted the pressure of the Persian front, Alexander ordered a flanking charge from the right. His cavalry crossed the river, broke the enemy line, and, with a ferocity that allowed no pause, headed directly toward the center where the great king was. Darius, seeing that the Persian right wing was beginning to collapse and that the enemy was approaching his position, panicked. His chariot became stuck among fallen bodies and the debris of the terrain, and he was forced to abandon the field in haste. He fled on horseback, escorted by a small group of horsemen, while the bulk of his army began to crumble into chaos. The image of an emperor fleeing from his mobile throne, leaving behind not only royal dignity, but his entire family, wife, daughters, and mother, was more powerful than any conventional victory. Alexander captured not only the Persian camp, but also the aura of invincibility that surrounded the kings of Asia. In the chests of the royal entourage, he found treasures, weapons, letters, and documents revealing Darius's plans. But the most significant moment was the encounter with the women of the court. Far from humiliating them, Alexander treated them with absolute respect, ordering that their dignity, safety, and privacy be ensured. He greeted the mother of Darius with solemnity, and when she, in confusion, mistook him for her son because of his bearing and armor, he did not correct her. He embraced her as a queen, and from that moment on, she considered him her true sovereign. This gesture was not a cold strategy. It was, at the same time, a diplomatic action and an act of humanity. Alexander understood that to rule the world he intended to conquer, he had to be accepted not only as a warrior, but as a legitimate figure. And that legitimacy was not won with swords, but with symbols. Compassion, in that context, was a higher form of dominion. Meanwhile, the consequences of the Battle of Issus spread like concentric waves across the map. In Asia Minor, the cities that still hesitated about their loyalty began to turn toward Alexander. In Greece, even his former adversaries were beginning to recognize that they were facing someone who could not be contained by the traditional limits of power. In Persia, Darius began to be questioned, not so much for his military defeat as for having abandoned the field and left his family in the hands of the enemy. But Alexander did not stop to enjoy the triumph. He knew the blow had been strong but not decisive. Darius still possessed vast resources, intact armies in the east, loyal allies, and entire satrapies still under his control. The war, although leaning in Alexander's favor, was far from over. However, what he had achieved at Issus was something deeper than a victory in battle. He had conquered fear. He had shown that the Colossus could bleed, that imperial power was not eternal, that a new, young, brilliant force could disrupt the balance of centuries. That certainty settled in his army like a flame. The soldiers looked at him differently. He was no longer just their king. He was a figure beginning to merge with legend. A man who could challenge an entire empire and emerge unscathed. Every step he took, every word he spoke, felt charged with a different energy. As if destiny was no longer something to be awaited, but something to be built with each passing day. And so, while the campfires slowly went out over the remains of the battlefield, and the sea roared against the nearby rocks, Alexander was already thinking of his next move. The gates of Phoenicia were open. The fortresses of the south awaited, and on the horizon, the figure of Darius, humiliated but still powerful, began to gather what was left of his empire. The game was not over. It had only become more personal. The conquest of the eastern Mediterranean. The Battle of Issus had not only been a military victory, it had been a turning point. Darius III had fled, leaving behind his family, his treasures, and most importantly, his moral authority. Alexander, by defeating a king and not an ordinary army, had called into question the legitimacy of the Persian throne in the eyes of the known world. Cities began to fall without the need for siege, satraps deserted, alliances dissolved. But Alexander did not make the mistake of remaining to celebrate what had been achieved. He knew that there was still much to conquer, and that days of glory could fade if he did not advance with intelligence and speed. From Cilicia, the most logical path would have been to head directly toward Mesopotamia in search of Darius. But Alexander chose another course. His mind thought like that of a strategist, but also like that of an emperor in the making. If he left behind the coastal cities of the Mediterranean without securing them, he risked the still powerful Persian fleet cutting his supply lines, attacking from the sea, and sowing instability in his rear. In addition, many of these cities were major commercial ports, true strategic nodes whose possession meant control over the most important maritime routes of the ancient world. Thus began his march south, toward Phoenicia and the coastline that stretched between the Levant and Egypt, a region rich in history, economic power, and diplomatic complexities. His first step was to take Marathon and Abydos, cities that offered no resistance. Sidon, one of the jewels of Phoenicia, fell into Macedonian hands in an almost ceremonial manner. Alexander appointed as king a descendant of the ancient local dynasty, respecting traditions and thus winning the favor of the people. This was his way of ruling. He did not impose uniformity, but rather a flexible order where submission was sealed with diplomacy as much as with the spear. But not all enclaves responded the same. On the way south, Alexander encountered an obstacle that would test not only his military capability, but also his patience, his determination, and his will never to retreat. That obstacle had a name: Tyre. Tyre was a unique city. Situated on a rocky island just over half a kilometer from the coast, it rose surrounded by walls that seemed to grow out of the sea. For centuries, it had been a naval bastion, an incomparable commercial center, and a symbol of Phoenician resistance. When Alexander sent emissaries requesting surrender, the local magistrates responded with courtesy, but without commitment. They allowed the Macedonian army to offer sacrifices in the mainland temples, but made it clear that the island of Tyre remained autonomous. Alexander understood the message. The city would not surrender, and he, who had never tolerated a refusal, decided that he would not leave without his standard waving over its towers. The siege of Tyre was one of the most extraordinary and tenacious episodes of his entire campaign. It was not a simple military capture. The city was separated from the mainland, fortified to the point of impossibility, and protected by a large and experienced fleet. To conquer it, Alexander made a radical decision. He would build an artificial isthmus that would connect the coast to the island, a colossal work of engineering that challenged not only the sea, but the very logic of traditional sieges. For months, thousands of men worked under the sun, the wind, and enemy arrows to create a solid causeway that would allow the advance of siege towers and war machines. Each meter gained was contested by the Phoenician fleet, which launched sudden attacks to destroy what had been built. Alexander responded by reinforcing his ships, protecting the work with mobile shields, and sending divers to cut enemy anchors. The sea, which seemed to play on the side of the besieged, began little by little to lean toward the invaders. The will of Alexander was denser than water. Finally, after 7 months of brutal resistance, the western wall was breached. The Macedonian troops entered in blood and fire. The fury contained during the long siege was unleashed in an explosion of violence. Thousands of Tyrians were massacred, many others sold as slaves, and the city was taken without mercy. Only the temples and some dignitaries were spared. Alexander had wanted to send a message, and he had done so with the clarity of an irrefutable sentence. No wall was high enough, no island far enough, no rejection diplomatic enough to stop him. After the fall of Tyre, the rest of the coastline fell like pieces of domino. Gaza tried to resist, entrenched between its walls and its biblical history. But Alexander, even with a severe wound in his shoulder after the battle, ordered the assault and took the city with the same determination as in previous sieges. The route to Egypt was now open. While the army regrouped and the coastal cities began to integrate into the new network of Macedonian dominance, Alexander once again displayed his imperial vision. In each city he took, he founded structures of government, left loyal garrisons, reorganized trade, and restructured the fiscal systems. He did not act like an invader who destroys and moves on. He was already a ruler who administered, planned, and built upon what he conquered a lasting structure. What he was building was not a road to plunder, but an architecture of power. The Phoenician fleets, now at the service of the new master, began to control the sea in his name. The trade routes began to flow again, but no longer toward Susa or Babylon, but toward the interests of the Macedonian. Alexander had understood something essential. The domination of the sea was not won through naval battles, but through the control of ports, markets, and the cities where the real power of commerce was woven. As news of his conquests spread along the routes of the Mediterranean, the name of Alexander began to acquire a different tone. He was no longer the young king who triumphed in open field. Now he was a more complex figure, capable of destroying an impregnable city, but also of ruling with cunning and respect. For the Eastern peoples, that duality made him more than a conqueror. It elevated him to the rank of a figure destined by the gods, a sovereign with the face of a warrior and the soul of a builder. And thus, while the last columns of smoke rose from the ruins of Tyre and the Macedonian ships patrolled the reconquered coasts, Alexander turned his gaze to the south. Beyond the desert, across the eternal sands, lay an ancient, enigmatic, and majestic land, a land that had fascinated the Greeks for centuries. Egypt. There awaited him other temples, other gods, another people. And what he would find in those lands would change his vision of the world forever. The arrival at the Nile. When Alexander crossed the border that separated the sands of Gaza from the vastness of the Egyptian desert, he did so without having to brandish a single sword. Egypt, the ancient land of pharaohs and pyramids, offered him no resistance. The Persian Empire, weakened after defeats in Asia Minor and the loss of naval control over the Mediterranean, barely retained authority in that region. The satrap who governed in the name of Darius did not even attempt to confront him. He opened the gates of the country as one who recognizes not the arrival of an enemy, but the passage of a new sovereign. Thus, Alexander entered Egypt, not as a ruthless conqueror, but as an awaited liberator. The relationship between the Egyptians and the Persians had been complex, and in many aspects hostile. Although the pharaonic civilization had known how to adapt to multiple occupations throughout the centuries, the Achaemenid domination had left scars, heavy taxes, religious offenses, repression of local customs. When Alexander entered Memphis, the administrative capital of Lower Egypt, the reception was solemn, respectful, and at the same time filled with a sense of collective relief. For the first time in a long while, Egypt seemed to have once again a ruler who, although foreign, understood the weight of symbols and knew how to listen to the murmur of the ancient gods. Alexander did not waste this opportunity. Instead of imposing his own vision, he integrated himself into the world he found. He participated in traditional ceremonies, offered sacrifices in the temples of Apis and Osiris, and adopted the sacred iconography with ease. He did not seek to erase the past. He invoked it. He allowed the priests to crown him as pharaoh, not out of vanity, but because he understood that real power resided not only in spears, but in rites, in words pronounced beneath stone columns, in the mystical acceptance of conquered peoples. He presented himself as the legitimate son of Amun, the invisible god of the desert, father of the universe according to Egyptian theology, and no one doubted that such a bond was possible. During his stay in Memphis, Alexander was received as a traditional pharaoh, and his gestures were not mere diplomatic adaptations. There was in him a genuine fascination with the Egyptian worldview, with their way of understanding time, death, and eternity. He spent hours conversing with the priests, learning ancient names, interpreting inscriptions, and asking about the afterlife. It was not simple curiosity. It was a quest. In Egypt, Alexander found something he had not yet possessed, a vision of immortality that was not related only to glory, but to the fusion with the divine. But the most enigmatic moment of his passage through these lands did not occur in the cities of the Nile, but in a remote place, in the heart of the western desert. There stood the sanctuary of Siwa, a lost oasis among dunes and hills of stone, where the priests of the god Amun, the Egyptian Zeus, maintained one of the oldest and most respected oracles of the ancient world. Alexander decided to make the journey there, despite the dangers of the route, ignoring the warnings of his generals. No one knew for certain what he sought, but he did. The journey was arduous. Sandstorms nearly buried the group on more than one occasion. The guides lost their way, and there were moments when the water began to run low. Legend has it that desert snakes marked their path, or that two ravens flew above them until leading them to the oasis. The truth is that Alexander reached Siwa and was received by the priests with gestures that unsettled even his companions. They greeted him as son of the god before he had spoken a single word. Then, in the silence of the temple, alone and in darkness, he consulted the oracle. No one knows what was said inside. When he emerged, he revealed no details, only a brief smile and words that left their mark in history. I have received my answer. From that moment on, Alexander began to behave as though he had been confirmed as divine. Not with arrogance, but with a different aura, as if his destiny was no longer a human matter. Those around him began to notice subtle changes. His way of speaking, of deciding, even of walking, seemed increasingly distant from the ordinary. For some, this was a sign of delusion. For others, a conviction that made him invulnerable. But for him, it was simply the logical continuation of what he had always felt, that his existence did not obey the same rules as other men. During his time in Egypt, Alexander also laid the foundations of something that would survive long beyond his own life. In the delta of the Nile, by the sea, he founded a city, Alexandria. Its location was chosen carefully, halfway between traditional Egypt and the Hellenic world. It was a natural harbor, ideal for trade, but also for becoming a crossroads of cultures. He ordered its streets to be laid out in geometric symmetry, in the Greek style, but respecting Egyptian elements. He commissioned the construction of temples, neighborhoods, markets, and a great library that did not yet exist, but that he already envisioned. That city, which in centuries to come would be home to scholars, alchemists, astronomers, and mystics, was conceived as a meeting point between East and West, between memory and the future. Egypt was not a military campaign. It was a transformation. Alexander did not limit himself to taking possession of a territory. He allowed himself to be permeated by it. He incorporated its symbols, its beliefs, its structures, and that experience marked a point of no return. From then on, his vision of empire was no longer limited to the Greek world. He began to project it as a universal order, capable of absorbing cultures without destroying them, of uniting what seemed opposite under a single horizon. The young king of Macedonia was becoming something else, something that did not yet have a name. When he left Egypt, he did so with a new title, a new city, and a conviction firmer than ever. He felt guided by the gods, protected by the signs of destiny, and ready to face for the second time the one who still dared to call himself King of Kings. Darius had managed to escape from Issus, but now Alexander was coming for him, not only with weapons, but with a vision. And there was no city, empire, or desert that could stop what was already in motion. Destiny is decided at Gaugamela. The dawn of the 1st of October of the year 331 before Christ was unlike any other. Upon the vast plains of Gaugamela, in the heart of the Persian Empire, two worlds prepared to collide with an intensity that allowed no return. This was not just another battle in Alexander's long chain of conquests. It was the definitive confrontation between two conceptions of power, between a king born of the lineage of the Achaemenids and a young man who, with each step, was ceasing to be a man and becoming a myth. Gaugamela was not merely a place. It was a stage woven by the gods, a board where the future was placed at stake with every move, with every breath held before the clash. After his passage through Egypt, Alexander had reinforced his army, reorganized his logistics, and traced a route that once again brought him toward the heart of the Asian continent. His objective was clear: to reach Darius, to defeat him without leaving room for doubt, and to break the last pillar that sustained the idea of an intact Persian empire. Darius, aware that this would be his final opportunity to change the course of events, prepared with a meticulousness he had never before shown. He gathered an immense army, recruited from the shores of the Indus to the coasts of the Aegean. War elephants, chariots with scythes fixed to their wheels, heavy infantry, Scythian horsemen, Babylonian archers. It was a multicolored symphony of armed forces under one banner, but without the cohesion of a single will. Alexander, for his part, marched with inflexible discipline. His army was much smaller in number, but each unit functioned like a perfect gear. The Macedonian infantry, with its phalanx of endless sarissas, the hypaspists, light and lethal, the elite cavalry led by himself. It was not about size, but about precision, strategy, and an almost instinctive knowledge of the terrain and the enemy. When he reached the vicinity of Gaugamela, he personally inspected the field, understanding that every rise in the ground, every patch of shade, could be decisive. Darius had chosen the place carefully. He had ordered the ground leveled so that his chariots could be deployed effectively. The space was open, flat, seemingly perfect for a victory by overwhelming force. His camp was decorated with luxury, the throne mounted on a visible platform, surrounded by the royal guard. Everything seemed to indicate that he was sure of himself, confident that this time the balance would tip in his favor. The night before the battle, Alexander rested. His generals found him sleeping deeply, something that many found incomprehensible given the magnitude of what was about to happen. When they asked him why he could sleep so peacefully, his answer was as simple as it was revealing. Because I have already thought of everything. And indeed, he had thought of everything. The combat began early, with the sun still low on the horizon. Darius deployed his forces with extreme width, trying to envelop the Macedonian lines. The noise of the chariots as they advanced sounded like the roar of a storm, But Alexander was not impressed. He gave the precise order: maintain the formation, withstand the advance, and wait for the moment to strike from the right flank. What followed was a lethal choreography. While the center held the initial onslaught, Alexander and his cavalry wheeled to the right, seeking the weak point between the Persian guard and the auxiliary troops. Darius, noticing the movement, was forced to alter his lines. The tension was palpable. For a few moments, everything seemed to hang by a thread. But then, Alexander's strategy revealed its full force. He broke in with his cavalry at an angle no Persian general had foreseen. It was not a frontal charge. It was a surgical penetration, a spear aimed directly at the heart, the throne, at Darius himself. History repeated itself. As at Issus, the great king lost his composure. Seeing his flank give way and feeling the tremor of his escort, he ordered the retreat. He fled once more. He did so before the battle was completely decided, before his troops had fully collapsed. He left the field, his chariot, his authority. His soldiers, sensing the flight, began to scatter. What had been a colossal structure turned into a chaotic mass. The infantry was massacred, the chariots abandoned, the elephants captured. The field of Gaugamela was left strewn with bodies, broken banners, and armor shattered by fury and fear. Alexander did not pursue Darius immediately. He first secured the victory, consolidated his positions, and reorganized his units. He knew that victory was not only the end of combat, but its control. When he finally advanced, he did so with the calm of one who no longer fights for just another conquest, but for the closing of an era. The Battle of Gaugamela was not only the end of the organized resistance of the Persian Empire. It was the moment when Alexander ceased to be an extraordinary general and became the Lord of Asia. That day, the ancient world shifted its axis. The eastern capitals began to open their gates. Babylon surrendered without a fight. Susa handed over its treasure. Persepolis awaited its fate. And in that landscape of ancient grandeur crumbling like forgotten temples, Alexander began to glimpse a different kind of power. It was no longer enough to win. Now he had to decide how to govern what he had inherited from a broken empire. The plain of Gaugamela, silent at dusk, was still steeped in the smell of iron and blood. But Alexander, as he looked upon it, did not seem to celebrate. He knew he had taken an irreversible step. He had defeated Darius. He had conquered the known world. Now he faced the most difficult challenge: to govern it without letting it destroy itself. And as night fell over the vastness, the steps of Alexander were already carrying him toward the heart of an empire that was beginning to call him its king, even if not all were yet willing to accept him. The Ghost of Darius. After Gaugamela, the map of the known world no longer rested on the names that had defined it for generations. What had once been a solid empire, steeped in rituals and powerful titles, was now a structure in ruins, sustained only by the shadow of the man who had once been its sovereign. Darius III, the great king, had lost his army, his prestige, and his ability to command, but not his title, nor his hope of reversing his fate. While Alexander marched toward Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, Darius fled along the inner roads of Asia, as if trying to rebuild himself while in flight, as if believing that the heart of the empire could still beat somewhere the invader had not yet reached. But what he had left was no longer power. It was an echo. Darius moved surrounded by an escort that grew smaller and smaller, attempting to gather support among the satraps of the eastern regions. Some were still loyal to him. Others feigned obedience while secretly preparing betrayal. The Persian Empire, so vast it seemed immortal, was now fractured into a network of interests that no longer answered to a single will. And as Alexander advanced, each of his steps was a reminder that he was not merely confronting a defeated king, but a ghost that refused to accept its condition. the young conqueror did not allow the euphoria of victory to distract him. After taking Susa, where he obtained a treasure so colossal that gold had to be melted into ingots for days in order to be transported, he headed toward Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the empire. It was the city of kings, the symbolic heart of Achaemenid power, an architectural jewel raised by Darius I and Xerxes. And there, among carved columns, sacred friezes, and palaces scented with incense and the passage of centuries, Alexander made a decision that would mark his reign forever. He allowed the city to be plundered. For one night, the soldiers surrendered themselves to the spoils, and then, according to the most widespread version, a fire consumed the main halls of the palace of Xerxes. Some say it was an accident, provoked by the celebrations. Others say it was a deliberate order, and there are those who claim that it was a woman, a Greek courtesan named Thais, who incited the act as revenge for the Persian destruction of Athens during the Greco-Persian Wars. Whatever the motive, Persepolis burned. And in that fire, Alexander seemed to burn more than just a city. He consumed an era. What had begun as a conquest was now becoming a symbolic replacement. The new master was not inheriting the ancient glories. He was consuming them to build something different. Meanwhile, Darius, increasingly isolated, began his final journey. He headed toward Bactria, one of the most distant and mountainous regions of the empire, trusting in the loyalty of one of his most experienced generals, Bessus, the satrap of the area, a shrewd and ambitious man. But that choice would be his ruin. Because Bessus, seeing that real power was slipping from his master's hands, made a cold and calculated decision. If he could not defeat Alexander under the banner of Darius, perhaps he could do so in his own name. He planned the betrayal with patience. He waited for the moment when Darius was most vulnerable, surrounded by a small retinue, without access to armies, without any real possibility of reorganizing. And then, he seized him. The news reached Alexander like a sharp blow. For months he had pursued Darius across the plains of Media, crossing valleys, navigating impossible passes, sending envoys who offered clemency in exchange for surrender. But Darius, though humiliated, had refused to give himself up. When Alexander learned that he was in the hands of his own men, he quickened his march. Not out of hatred, nor even immediate ambition, but because he sensed that he was about to close the cycle. That capturing Darius alive would mean more than a victory. It would be the final act of his rise as the legitimate emperor of Asia. But he arrived too late. Somewhere near Ecbatana, in a dusty place, the Macedonian army found Darius abandoned in a cart, covered in blood, still alive, but mortally wounded. He had been stabbed by his captors during their flight. According to legend, he managed to recognize Alexander's men before dying and asked them for water. A Greek soldier gave him a drink and assured him that his king would arrive soon. Darius, they say, breathed his last without resentment, grateful not to die alone. When Alexander found his body, he knelt beside him. He covered the corpse with his imperial cloak. He wept. The scene, more than symbolic, was deeply human. The conqueror who had destroyed his empire did not despise him. He granted him a royal burial. He ordered his body to be embalmed and taken with full honors to Persepolis. He presented himself before the Persian nobles not as a usurper, but as the legitimate heir to the dynasty, assuring them that he would avenge his death. From that moment on, Bessus ceased to be a satrap and became a criminal. Alexander was no longer pursuing a rival, but a traitor to the throne he now claimed to protect. And so, with Darius dead, Alexander found himself facing a paradox. The enemy had disappeared, but the war had not ended. Resistance still remained. Persian generals still controlled entire regions. The empire, though decapitated, refused to disintegrate completely. And Alexander, who had once dreamed of returning victorious to Macedonia, began to understand that there was no turning back. He had crossed an invisible line, a moral and political frontier from which there was no return. Darius, even in death, remained present. His image floated in councils, in decisions, in cities that still hesitated between surrender and resistance. He was a political ghost, a persistent shadow that influenced every step. And Alexander, although he had defeated him, would have to live with that presence until the end. The ancient world no longer had two kings. It had one. But the struggle to define what kind of king Alexander would be had only just begun. Babylon and the thirst for power. Babylon was not just any city. It was a symbol, a living relic of a past so dense that it still weighed upon the centuries. Founded in the mists of time, cradle of sages, prophets, and astrologers, it had been the capital of empires, a center of knowledge, and the stage of mythical visions. When Alexander approached its walls, he did so knowing that he was about to enter a place that breathed history. But he was not received as an invader. He was welcomed with solemnity, with ceremony, with respect. For he no longer came to impose the sword. He came as the heir to all that had fallen. The gates opened without a fight. The local authorities, aware that resistance would have been an act of suicide, chose diplomacy. And Alexander, who was beginning to master not only the fields of battle, but also the rituals of power, responded like a king of the ancient world. He entered the city on horseback, dressed in ornaments that evoked both the Greek gods and Persian symbols. The crowd cheered him. The atmosphere was charged with expectation. It was as if everyone understood that something greater than politics or war was taking place. In Babylon, Alexander found something he had not seen either in Persepolis or in Egypt, a perfect crossroads between tradition and ambition. The city was a center of astronomical knowledge, of writing, of medicine, and of advanced architecture. The Chaldean sages offered him readings of the stars, celestial maps that had been observed over generations. He listened attentively, as if searching in the stars for confirmation of what he already felt within, that he was destined not only to rule, but to change the history of the world. But this newly acquired power also began to shape him from within. Babylon, with its luxury, its complexity, its refinement, was a mirror reflecting a different version of Alexander. He was no longer the young Macedonian king raised by Philip, nor the student of the severe Aristotle. He began to behave like a monarch of Asia, surrounded by courtiers, by rituals foreign to his culture of origin. He allowed himself to be worshipped according to Persian customs, accepted greetings that required prostration, and his closest circle began to feel that something within him was slowly shifting. What to some was the necessary adaptation to a new empire, to others was the first sign of an ambition that now knew no limits. Babylon offered opportunities, but also invisible traps. Alexander began to surround himself with Eastern advisors, some of whom spoke languages that his Macedonian generals could not understand. This barrier, which at first was practical, soon became symbolic. Many of his men began to feel that they were losing contact with the man they had followed since the plains of Pella. The distances were no longer only geographical. They were mental, cultural, almost spiritual. Alexander advanced, but not all followed him at the same pace. It was in this context that he began making decisions that unsettled his men. One of these was the adoption of Persian dress during certain ceremonies. Another was the incorporation of enemy soldiers into his own ranks. And perhaps the most controversial, the attempt to impose proskynesis, a bow that required kneeling before the king, as was done before Oriental monarchs. For a Greek or a Macedonian, this was intolerable. Kings could be respected, but not worshipped. Alexander, however, insisted that this was not idolatry, but a form of unity. He wished to build an empire where all cultures felt represented. But his men, proud of their identity, began to see in these decisions an act of betrayal. Tension grew. Rumors spread quietly through the palace corridors. The distance between the king and his generals became increasingly palpable. And then something happened that would deepen the rift. The death of Clitus, called the Black, one of the most senior and loyal officers of the Macedonian army. During a banquet, amid wine and ill-chosen words, Clitus criticized the king's new customs, accused him of forgetting his roots, of behaving like just another Persian. Alexander, inflamed by alcohol and fury, drove a spear through him. He killed him with his own hands. And when the frenzy subsided, he wept inconsolably. But it was too late. Something had broken. The episode was more than a personal tragedy. It was a warning. Alexander, in his desire to fuse East and West into a single imperial body, was beginning to sacrifice part of what had brought him this far. Power, that subtle force that cannot be seen but can be felt, was beginning to transform him. And in Babylon, that power spread like a slow poison. He was no longer content with conquering territories. He wished to shape the world in his own image, to absorb it, to reform it from the ruins to the ceremonies. Yet not all was darkness in those days. Alexander also carried out brilliant administrative reforms, founded cities, ordered the construction of roads, and established trade networks. Babylon became the center of a new kind of empire, where archives coexisted with rituals and the sword with the written word. From there, the next campaigns were planned, spoils were distributed, and marriages between Greek officers and Persian women were arranged, a policy of fusion that, though resisted, was beginning to bear fruit. But the air remained heavy with omens. The augurs warned that the king was increasingly alone, and Alexander's dreams grew more and more confusing. He spoke of new worlds, of crossing the Indus, of reaching the ocean that marked the end of the earth. Babylon, instead of being the final destination, became the starting point for a new obsession: to reach the limit of the imaginable. And so, while the Euphrates flowed slowly under the blazing sun, the king prepared to advance once more. It was no longer a matter of conquering out of necessity, or politics, or even glory. It was a force that drove him from within, something difficult to explain, something that went beyond ambition. Perhaps, deep within his soul, Alexander already sensed that his story could never rest. That rest was, in fact, the one thing he could not allow himself. The weddings of Susa and the impossible experiment. Alexander's march toward the east was not merely a military or territorial matter. As his armies advanced into the remote regions of the former Persian Empire, he seemed increasingly determined to reconfigure not only maps, but also customs, hierarchies, and the very mental structures through which East and West had perceived one another for centuries. And among all the gestures that defined his ambition to achieve a real integration between cultures, none was as symbolic, as deliberate, and at the same time as deeply controversial as the one that took place in Susa. Susa, city of ancient kings and imperial administration, was chosen as the setting for a ceremony that Alexander designed not as a display of power, but as an affirmation of political vision. There, beneath the austere columns of the royal palace, he organized what would be remembered as one of the most theatrical acts of his reign: a multiple wedding between dozens of Macedonian officers and noble Persian women. He himself led the ceremony, marrying Statera, daughter of Darius III, in a gesture intended not only to legitimize his throne before the Persians, but also to seal a symbolic alliance between the defeated lineage and the new master of the continent. The event was colossal. Silk pavilions were erected, the gardens were adorned with flowers brought from different provinces, and the tables were laden with exotic fruits, roasted meats, fine wheat breads, and sweet wines from the east. For several days, the celebration continued with dances, music, and speeches that spoke of unity, of hope, of a new world in which differences would dissolve into a common identity. On the surface, it seemed like an imperial celebration, but for many who were present, the air smelled of tension. The Macedonian generals accepted marriage because it was a direct order, but they did so with reluctance. For them, these weddings were an unacceptable intrusion into their private lives, an identity sacrifice wrapped in political justifications. Some did not even speak the language of their new wives, and many knew that their marriages were not born of affection, but of strategic utility. Alexander's gesture, no matter how noble or visionary it might appear, was interpreted by several as an authoritarian imposition, an attempt to standardize something that by nature was diverse and irreconcilable. And yet, for Alexander, that ceremony represented the pinnacle of his imperial project. He did not want an empire where Greeks ruled over Persians like masters over slaves. He wanted a new political body, where Macedonian soldiers mixed with the Eastern nobility, where a mixed generation could be born that might rule without resentments or divisions. In his mind, it was possible to shape a new humanity through direct contact, through shared blood, through cohabitation if necessary. But that idea, so far ahead of its time, also proved to be his most utopian limit. Rumors began to spread as soon as the last dance ended. Some said that the Persian women did not easily accept their new husbands, that they wept in silence, that they did not understand the language or the customs. Others pointed out that many officers sought excuses to separate as soon as possible, claiming incompatibilities, disloyalties, or simply repulsion. The fusion that Alexander dreamed of, in practice, began to fracture from the first day. And as if the universe wished to confirm the fragility of that experiment, in the following months increasingly serious tensions began to arise within the army. The Macedonian soldiers, who for years had followed their king under extreme conditions, began to feel that they were being displaced by new elements. Persian warriors, Babylonian officials, young recruits from foreign lands. Some felt that they were no longer necessary, that the very man they had raised to the throne was replacing them with others they barely knew. The fracture became evident in an incident that took place shortly afterward in Opis, when Alexander announced that he would discharge many Macedonian veterans in order to form a new multicultural army. The reaction was immediate: mutiny. For the first time, the loyalty of his own men wavered openly. They shouted, they rebelled, they refused to obey. Alexander, wounded to the core, reacted with violence. He arrested the leaders, executed several of them, and for days did not allow anyone to approach him. In his speeches, he called them ungrateful, barbarians, blind to the destiny he had prepared for all. But then came silence, and afterward, forgiveness. In an unexpected gesture, Alexander gathered his officers and spoke to them with a frankness he had rarely shown. He reminded them of everything they had achieved together: the battles, the hardships, the fallen comrades. He promised them that they would remain at the heart of his empire, but that the world could no longer be governed through the eyes of the past. He asked for their trust. Some wept, others embraced him. The revolt dissolved, but the echo of the fracture remained. The weddings of Susa, with all their splendor and speeches of unity, ended up demonstrating that forced unions, no matter how noble they may be, cannot endure if the peoples are not prepared to understand one another. It was a bitter lesson disguised as a celebration. And although the king tried with all his strength, neither love nor power can be imposed by decree. And as the court moved once again toward the east, toward even more remote lands, Alexander kept the image of those unions as an open possibility. Perhaps he thought that if not in his time, some future would make them real. Perhaps he still believed that his experiment, sown among dances, wine, and obedience, would one day germinate in the silence of generations. The legend in India. For Alexander, limits were never fixed lines. They were invitations. Where others saw the end of the world, he imagined new routes, horizons yet to be discovered, unknown kingdoms to be conquered. After the weddings of Susa and the attempts, successful or not, to integrate two worlds, his gaze turned toward the east, because beyond the mountain ranges and deserts that marked the borders of the Persian Empire lay a mysterious land, sacred to some, feared by others. A region where the landscape, the customs, and the gods seemed to arise from a different logic. India. The path was not simple. From the region of Bactria, Alexander began a march that would test even the endurance of his most battle-hardened veterans. The routes were narrow, steep, covered in mist or scorching dust, and progress was slow. They had to open their way through mountains that did not appear on maps, cross unpredictable rivers, and deal with peoples who, although they had no organized armies, offered fierce resistance from the shadows of the jungle. And yet, the desire to advance seemed to overcome any military logic. Because what Alexander sought in India was not only more land, it was an answer, a mirror in which to find the final face of his ambition. Along the way, he forged alliances with some local rulers, such as King Taxiles, who offered him his friendship and his capital without presenting battle. Taxiles, shrewd and aware of Alexander's fame, understood that resisting was to condemn himself. He preferred to negotiate. He offered him war elephants, guides, supplies, and in that agreement, both found what they sought. Alexander, a foothold in a strange land. Taxiles, a shield against his neighboring enemies. But not all thought the same. A few kilometers away ruled Porus, a proud monarch who did not accept the imposed conditions nor the diplomatic offers. He was tall, strong, respected by his troops, and commanded an army singularly dangerous, the first real enemy Alexander would face in Asia with organized units of war elephants. Porus did not fear the Macedonian conqueror. He believed in his gods, in his land, in his cause. And when the time came, he did not hesitate to present battle. The encounter took place on the banks of the river Hydaspes. It was the rainy season, the ground was muddy, the winds heavy with moisture, and visibility was limited. Alexander, true to his style, did not attack head-on. He took advantage of the night, crossed the river in silence with part of his army, surprised the enemy from an unexpected flank, and divided his forces into mobile units that adapted to the weight, slowness, and devastating force of the elephants. The battle was fierce, disordered, and confusing. But finally, tactical intelligence prevailed. Porus was defeated. But the most remarkable moment came afterward. When he was brought before Alexander, wounded, exhausted, but still standing, he refused to bow. The Macedonian king asked him how he wished to be treated. Porus, without blinking, replied, "Like a king." That answer not only surprised Alexander, it fascinated him, because within those words there was a dignity that transcended defeat, a reflection even of his own vision of the world. And so, in a gesture few would have anticipated, he returned his kingdom to him and made him his ally. That scene, simple in appearance, was the most symbolic moment of the entire Indian campaign, because for an instant, Alexander seemed to understand that greatness is not always in subjugating, but in recognizing the nobility of the defeated. It was a lesson, a pause in the middle of a race of conquests. But it was also a mirage, because the journey was not yet over. As they went deeper into India, the landscapes became more hostile, the distances more immeasurable, the peoples more unknown. The tropical rains turned the roads into swamps. The heat was suffocating, and the soldiers began to break. They had traveled thousands of kilometers, seen the unimaginable, buried hundreds of companions. And now they marched toward the abyss, because no one knew where that territory ended, nor whether an end truly existed. It was then that, in an unprecedented act of defiance, the army stopped. They refused to continue. At the river Hyphasis, the officers and soldiers, even the most loyal, begged him to return. That they had already done enough. That they had defeated kings, crossed deserts, founded cities. That now they wanted to go home. Alexander, deep inside, resisted. But he understood that a leader cannot advance alone. He wept, it is said, when accepting that his eastern campaign had come to an end. He erected altars to the gods, sacrificed sacred animals, and gave the order to return. But the return was no relief. It was a nightmare. Instead of taking the safe route north, Alexander decided to cross the desert of Gedrosia, a vast arid territory without water, without shade, without roads. Some believe he wanted to punish his army. Others say he sought a challenge to test his will. The truth is that the crossing was hell. Thousands died. Animals, men, carts. The wind cut the skin, the sun blinded them, hunger weakened them. Alexander, it is told, refused water offered to him while his men suffered. He wanted to share every pain, but the damage was already done. And so, after years of marching, of dreams, of impossible conquests, Alexander returned to the heart of the empire with an army tired, reduced, but still loyal. His gaze was no longer that of the impetuous youth of Issus or Gaugamela. It was different, graver, more introspective. Because he had touched the edges of the world, had looked into the eyes of millennia-old civilizations, and had understood that, even in victory, there are limits that no man can cross without paying a price. The return and the darkness. Alexander returned from the east with a different gaze. It was not that of the young warrior who had departed with a thirst for glory, but of someone who had looked too far, too deep, and had brought back more than just scars. He was a man who had conquered impossible lands, who had defeated monarchs and jungles, but who now returned surrounded by questions, by absences, and by a fatigue that no triumph could dispel. Behind him lay India, the war elephants, the torrential rains, the uprisings barely put down. Now the horizon was drier, more familiar, yet also more barren in a symbolic sense. Because returning did not mean resting. It carried with it the accumulated weight of every promise, of every friend lost, of every gesture that history does not forgive. And in that return, Alexander began to lose something that had sustained every one of his campaigns, his sense of direction. The crossing of the Gedrosian desert had been a devastating mistake. It is estimated that more than 2/3 of his army died during that infernal march. Men, animals, cargo, everything disintegrated under a sun without shade and a dry wind that turned the air into burning dust. Those who survived did so with cracked skin, reddened eyes, and broken faith. And although Alexander walked among them, sharing their misery, the general feeling was that the march had no purpose, that it had been a punishment or madness. When they finally reached Carmania, the reception was somber. Alexander tried to rebuild the spirits of his men with celebrations, banquets, improvised parades. He wanted to restore to them the idea of victory. But the faces remained the same, gaunt, silent, hardened. Because glory was no longer enough, because the price had been too high. And although the king strove to maintain the illusion that everything was under control, the darkness had begun to grow within. In this context, fractures began to appear. Some of his closest officers started to question him in hushed voices. Craterus, Ptolemy, even the loyal Hephaestion, each in their own way, tried to understand what drove the king to continue without rest, even when everything suggested that the empire was already large enough. Alexander spoke of new plans, of building a fleet, of exploring the Arabian Peninsula, of connecting the world by sea. But his words no longer ignited the enthusiasm they once had. Now they sounded like the obsession of someone who did not know how to stop. And then something happened that ended up destabilizing him. Hephaestion, his closest friend, his confidant, his other self, fell ill in Ecbatana. It was a sudden, devastating fever. Some say it was a poorly treated infection. Others speak of poisoning. What is certain is that Alexander refused to accept the inevitable. He summoned the best doctors, fasted, wept, prayed. But it was useless. Hephaestion died, and with him, a vital part of Alexander's soul. The reaction was excessive. He ordered all the lights in the city to be extinguished. He forbade music, celebrations. He ordered the execution of the doctor who had been unable to save him. He refused to eat for days. And then, as if grief had transformed him into something else, he decided to erect a funerary monument that would surpass all others, a colossal mausoleum worthy of a god. Because to him, Hephaestion was not simply a general. He was the other half of his existence. The court observed him in silence. They knew that something had broken. Alexander, although he still walked upright, seemed inhabited by a void impossible to fill. His decisions became erratic. He changed plans frequently, locked himself alone for hours, spoke with priests and oracles. He had begun to consult omens with a sickly insistence. Sometimes he said that he still had a destiny to fulfill. Other times, that death was following close behind him. In this state of mind, he arrived in Babylon, a city heavy with symbolism, but also with omens. The priests warned that the gods were displeased. Some astrologers foretold an approaching tragedy. There were those who claimed that a serpent had coiled itself on the throne during the night. Alexander, who had always defied superstition, now listened with fearful attention. And then, the symptoms began. A fever, intense, persistent. At first, it alarmed no one. It was common for soldiers and travelers to fall ill after crossing unfamiliar regions. But within days, Alexander could no longer stand. Then he stopped speaking. Eventually, he could no longer move his limbs. The doctors surrounded him without clear answers. His generals waited, day after day, outside the door of his chamber, wondering if the man they had followed for a decade was fading before their eyes. For a brief moment, Alexander seemed to regain his speech. He called his officers one by one and bade them farewell with his gaze. He entrusted them with his ring, but did not name a clear successor. He only said, "To the strongest." Then he returned to silence. And then the darkness. The last ambition. When Alexander died, the empire trembled, but it did not fall, at least not immediately. His still warm body rested among the columns of the palace in Babylon, while his generals looked at one another, knowing that the real battle was only just beginning. For the man who had conquered everything, who had overcome time and space, had left no clear instructions. His only phrase, murmured amid fever and delirium, echoed like a prophetic riddle. To the strongest. But who was the strongest? What did that phrase truly mean? Was it a choice or a provocation? A warning or a mockery? None knew for certain. The only evident truth was that the unity so painfully built now hung on an ambiguous word. The generals, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, Perdiccas, Lysimachus, began to emerge not as heirs to a dream, but as predators of an incalculable inheritance. Meanwhile, the king's body remained without burial. His funeral, far from being immediate, became another symbolic battlefield. Perdiccas, who had been named temporary regent, ordered the preparation of a majestic procession. A funeral carriage covered in gold, with Corinthian columns, sculpted lions, purple tapestries, and reinforced wheels, would carry Alexander's body from Babylon to the royal tomb in Macedonia. But Ptolemy, who was already thinking as a sovereign, intercepted the caravan in Syria and transported the body to Egypt. He claimed that the gods desired it so. The truth was different. With Alexander's corpse in his possession, his legitimacy rose. It was not a matter of respect, but of strategy. This funeral abduction was the starting point of an era history would know as the Wars of the Successors. It was not a single conflict, but a succession of betrayals, broken alliances, massacres, and clashing ambitions that would last for decades. The empire, vast, complex, heterogeneous, became ungovernable without its core, and thus, unity dissolved as dreams dissolve upon waking. But before all that happened, when the fever had not yet extinguished him completely, Alexander spoke of impossible things. His final plans were not those of an exhausted man, but of a visionary who still believed he had centuries ahead of him. He spoke of conquering Arabia, of building a fleet to sail around the entirety of Africa, of creating a common currency, of further mixing cultures, of founding new cities. He envisioned reforming the army, creating new trade routes, even organizing massive mixed marriages like those of Susa, but on a continental scale. These projects were not mere fantasies. In Babylon, his architects were already designing ports, canals, and fortresses. His cartographers were outlining coasts still unexplored. His bureaucracy was preparing to absorb new territories. Everything indicated that Alexander did not conceive of death, that he had not yet accepted his mortal condition, that his ambition, instead of diminishing, grew with every achievement. And yet, his body no longer followed him. The fever that had taken hold of him was not only physical. It was a reflection of accumulated exhaustion, of too many campaigns, of poorly healed wounds, of the symbolic poison that all greatness carries. His soul seemed more alive than ever, but his flesh was giving way. What remained was a king trapped between myth and biology, a man who dreamed of oceans while he sweated in his bed, unable to move. In his final days, surrounded by powerless doctors and expectant generals, Alexander asked for his army to march before him. He wanted to see their faces one last time, and they passed, in silence, looking upon the man who had led them to the ends of the world, now reduced to a pale, motionless figure, his gaze lost somewhere between consciousness and delirium. Some wept, others clenched their jaws, but all understood that this was the end. And yet, the end was never so clear. Because Alexander did not die entirely. He died as a man, yes, but was born as a legend. In Egypt, his tomb became a place of pilgrimage. In Asia, his conquests continued to shape borders. In Greece, his figure became a standard of comparison for all who came after. Some worshipped him as a god. Others accused him of tyranny, but none forgot him. The last ambition of Alexander, though unfulfilled in life, persisted in history. It was to fuse cultures, to transcend origins, to dissolve the limits between the known and the impossible. That idea, which many considered arrogant, was also his deepest legacy. For although his empire was divided, his image survived as a symbol of unity. And so, in the centuries that followed, emperors, philosophers, writers, and explorers would invoke him as an example, as an obsession, as a warning. His shadow would appear in Rome, in Byzantium, in the Crusades, in the modern age, because Alexander had touched something essential in the human spirit, the desire to go beyond, no matter the cost. The eternity of Alexander. There is no tomb that can contain a legend. There is no stone nor marble capable of stopping the passing of a story once it has been carved into the collective memory. And that is, perhaps, the last and most mysterious triumph of Alexander, that he vanished as a man, but remained as an idea that has crossed generations, languages, empires, and religions, a presence that still breathes in the corners of Western thought, and also in the hidden aspirations of the Eastern world. Because Alexander not only founded cities, not only defeated armies, not only altered maps, he founded a symbol. His death was the beginning of another existence, more diffuse, less physical, yet infinitely more enduring. In the centuries that followed, the kingdoms that divided his conquests, the realms of the Diadochi, the great generals who had once shared his campaigns, erected statues, wrote chronicles, and adapted his feats to justify their own dreams of glory. Ptolemy himself from Alexandria promoted a written account of the life of his former commander. Although fragmented by time, that work laid the foundations for the entire literary tradition that would follow. But what is truly fascinating was not what Alexander deliberately left behind, but what others saw in him. In Rome, Julius Caesar wept before his statue, feeling small compared to what that young Macedonian had accomplished before reaching the age of 33. In the times of the Byzantine Empire, his image was taken as the archetype of the absolute monarch, illuminated by the gods. In the medieval Islamic world, his name transformed into Iskandar and appeared in the Quran as a wise, almost prophetic figure. In the Christian Middle Ages, his exploits became literary epics, adorned with dragons, sorcerers, and invisible cities. For in each era, Alexander was something different. A mirror. There is no other ancient figure who has inspired such a fragmented and yet omnipresent biography. Manuscripts have been lost, legends have been interpolated, and contradictory images have been constructed. Some see him as a liberator, others as a despot. For some, he was an incomparable military genius. For others, a madman driven by delusions of grandeur. The truth, if such a thing exists, lies somewhere in between, or perhaps shifts with every interpretation. And that is part of his magic, that he cannot be entirely grasped. Yet the deepest legacy is not found in books, nor in sculptures, nor even in borders. It lies in ideas, because Alexander proved that identity does not have to be a prison, that peoples can mix, that curiosity can overcome fear, that ambition, when guided by a vision greater than greed, can change the course of humanity. His attempt to merge Greece with Persia, although it did not politically endure, left a lasting mark on Hellenistic thought, in science, in architecture, in art, in philosophy. In every city he founded, Alexandria in Egypt, Alexandria Escate, Alexandropolis, among many others, sprang centers of knowledge, markets, libraries, and schools. These enclaves, scattered across what today are dozens of countries, shaped a new way of understanding the world. As a network of cultures, of knowledge, of shared histories. And although many of those centers vanished over time, their influence spread like an underground current that remains alive. But the eternity of Alexander does not reside only in the memory of his deeds. It also lives in the questions he leaves unanswered. What would the world have been like if he had not died so young? Would he have succeeded in consolidating a truly global empire? Would he have transformed the structure of future empires? Or would it have collapsed all the same, crushed under the weight of its own size? These questions have no answer, and yet they still accompany us, because imagining what might have been is also a way of keeping the figure alive. And perhaps that is why his tomb has never been found, not in Alexandria, nor in Babylon, nor anywhere else. Some say it was destroyed. Others, that it lies hidden beneath the waters or beneath layers of history. But there are those who believe it will never be found because it is not meant to be found, because his true tomb is not physical. It is in every place where someone, even for a moment, dares to imagine the impossible. Alexander stopped breathing in Babylon, but his story kept walking on its own. It does so to this day, in every history class, in every novel inspired by his campaigns, in every documentary, in every conversation about ambition, power, and destiny. Because what he embodied, the fusion of the human and the divine, of desire and action, of the limit and the abyss remains an enigma that belongs to us. Perhaps that was the true plan, not to raise an enduring empire, but to leave a mark that would never fully fade away, to become a symbol of what human beings can achieve when they dare to break the rules, to challenge the gods, to lose themselves in the unknown in order to reinvent the world. There are not many figures who have accomplished that. Alexander did. And that is why, even though more than 2,000 years have passed, we are still telling his story. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life of Alexander the Great. If this story captivated you, tell me in the comments which part impacted you the most. Subscribe if you want to continue exploring the great figures and mysteries of history. Good night.